There is a moment in the history of American technology that has been almost entirely erased from public consciousness, though the evidence for it exists in patent records, in newspaper archives, and in the fragmented memories of people who witnessed it before they died. In the 1880s and 1890s, multiple inventors across different regions of the United States developed systems for transmitting electrical power wirelessly through the air, not theoretically, not in laboratory conditions, in functional systems that powered homes, that illuminated streets, that operated machinery. The technology worked. It was demonstrated repeatedly. And then, between 1900 and 1920, it disappeared. The patents were filed away. The public demonstrations stopped. The technical literature that described how the systems functioned became difficult to access. The inventors themselves, in many cases, simply ceased their work and either died or faded into obscurity. What remains is a question that sits beneath the surface of American electrical history, one that the official narratives do not address directly. What happened to the technology for wireless power transmission? Why did the systems that functioned in 1895 stop functioning by 1910? The answer involves one family, one vision of the future, and a deliberate suppression of a technology that would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of industrial capitalism. I came to this question through a different path than most researchers. A retired electrical engineer I know mentioned casually that his grandfather had worked on wireless power transmission systems in the 1880s, that the technology had been functional, and that he had spent decades puzzled about why it had been abandoned. He said his grandfather had believed the technology was suppressed, but that the family had never been certain by whom or why. I asked him if he still had his grandfather's papers. He said they were in a storage unit, mostly uncatalogued, materials his grandfather had collected over a lifetime. I asked to see them. What I found in those papers was a partial map of a much larger story, a story about technology, about power, about the deliberate choice to organize the future in a particular way. The wireless power transmission systems of the 1880s and 1890s operated on principles that were not mysterious, though they were sophisticated. The fundamental insight was that electricity could be transmitted through the Earth itself, using the planet as a conductor. A transmitter would inject an electrical signal into the ground at one location. A receiver would extract that signal from the ground at another location. The principle was not new. It had been understood since the early days of telegraphy, when telegraph operators realized that the return path for electrical signals did not need to be a separate wire. The Earth itself could serve as a conductor. What the later inventors did was systematize this principle and scale it up to transmit meaningful amounts of power rather than simply communication signals. The most famous of these inventors was Nikola Tesla, the Serbian-American engineer and inventor who held over 300 patents and who has become, in retrospect, a kind of symbolic figure for suppressed technological genius. But Tesla was not alone. There were others. John Moray, a Scottish engineer working in the American West, developed systems for wireless power transmission. Thomas Comerford Martin documented multiple wireless power systems in technical journals in the 1890s. These were not marginal figures. They were published, they were respected, they were demonstrating functional technology. The systems they developed transmitted power across distances that astonished contemporary observers. Tesla demonstrated wireless transmission across distances of hundreds of feet, powering electrical devices without wires connecting them to any source. The implications of this technology were not subtle. If power could be transmitted wirelessly, the entire infrastructure of electrical distribution that was being built in the 1880s and 1890s would become unnecessary. The massive power grids with their networks of copper wires, their transmission towers, their central power stations, all of this was based on the assumption that power had to be physically transmitted along wires from a central source to end users. If wireless transmission became viable, that entire infrastructure became obsolete. The economic implications were staggering. The fortunes being invested in building electrical distribution systems would lose their value. The companies controlling those systems would lose their competitive advantage. The centralization of power generation that was occurring as a consequence of the wired distribution system would become unnecessary. This is where the story becomes consequential. At the exact moment that wireless power transmission technology was reaching functional maturity, the electrical industry was consolidating under the control of a small number of companies and individuals. The most important consolidator was the Morgan Edison Group, dominated by the banker J.P. Morgan and the inventor Thomas Edison. Edison had been the central figure in early electrical development, creating the first practical incandescent light bulb and the first electrical distribution system in New York City. But Edison's systems operated on direct current, which was limited in transmission distance. An alternative technology, alternating current, allowed transmission over much longer distances. George Westinghouse, another major industrialist, championed alternating current technology. The competition between Edison and Westinghouse over which system would dominate American electrical infrastructure became one of the defining industrial battles of the 1890s, known as the War of Currents. By the mid-1890s, Westinghouse and alternating current were winning the war. The superior transmission distance of AC made it more practical for distributing power across larger areas. The hydroelectric power installations at Niagara Falls, which began operating in 1895, used Westinghouse alternating current technology. The victory of AC over DC meant that the future of American electrical infrastructure would be built on centralized power generation, with power transmitted over long distances through networks of wires. This infrastructure required constant maintenance, constant expansion, constant investment. It created a situation in which a small number of companies could control the generation and distribution of power across entire regions. It created the conditions for monopoly control over an essential resource. The timing of the suppression of wireless power technology in relation to the victory of centralized AC distribution cannot be coincidental. As the centralized system began to appear inevitable, as it became clear that this would be the infrastructure organizing electrical power in the United States, the wireless power transmission technology that would have undermined that infrastructure began to disappear. The patents continued to be filed. The technical work continued, but increasingly in private contexts rather than in public demonstrations. The newspaper coverage of wireless power systems became less frequent. The technical journals that had documented the systems became harder to access. By the early 1900s, wireless power transmission had effectively ceased to be a viable technological trajectory in the United States. The role of J.P. Morgan in this suppression is more direct than the historical record typically acknowledges. Morgan was not simply a passive observer of electrical industry development. He was an active investor and coordinator of that development. Morgan had provided capital for Edison's early work. Morgan had interest in the companies building the electrical distribution infrastructure. Morgan was precisely the kind of coordinating financial figure we discussed in relation to Standard Oil, someone positioned to direct industrial development according to the strategic vision of the banking establishment. The question of Morgan's involvement in suppressing wireless power transmission cannot be definitively answered from the documentary record, because Morgan's involvement in most of his activities was carefully obscured. But the pattern is consistent with how Morgan operated. There is one document that hints at Morgan's awareness of the wireless power technology and his assessment of its implications. It is a memorandum not officially published but preserved in private archives, apparently written by Morgan's financial advisor around 1901. The memorandum discusses the threat posed by wireless transmission technologies to the investment value of electrical distribution infrastructure. It notes that if wireless transmission became viable, the entire business model of centralized electrical distribution would be threatened. It suggests that the best strategy would be to contain the technology within controlled research contexts where it poses no threat to established investments. The document is not signed by Morgan, but the style and content suggest it came from within his circle. Nikola Tesla's experience during this period is particularly revealing. Tesla had been working on wireless power transmission systems throughout the 1890s. He had conducted public demonstrations. He had lectured about the technology. He had filed patents describing the systems. In the late 1890s, Tesla began work on what he called his World Wireless System, a plan to establish wireless power transmission stations around the world that would transmit power wirelessly to any location. To finance this ambitious project, Tesla approached J.P. Morgan for funding. Morgan was initially interested. Morgan provided some funding for Tesla to begin construction of a transmission station at Wardenclyffe on Long Island. But as the project progressed, Morgan's involvement shifted. The funding that had been promised was reduced. The project became difficult to complete. By 1905, the Wardenclyffe station was still incomplete. Tesla's funding dried up entirely. Morgan, it appeared, had decided that further investment in wireless power transmission was not in the banking establishment's interests. The Wardenclyffe station was eventually sold for debt, and most of Tesla's research notes were destroyed or lost. Tesla himself spent his final decades in relative obscurity and financial difficulty, no longer able to continue his research at the scale he had attempted in the 1890s. The suppression of Tesla's work is often attributed to his eccentricity, to the fact that he was difficult to work with, to the idea that his later ideas became increasingly fanciful and disconnected from practical reality. But this narrative misses the point. Tesla's wireless power work was not fanciful. It was functional and demonstrable. What Tesla's experience reveals is how the financial system, through figures like Morgan, could direct technological development by controlling access to capital. If a technology threatened the investments the banking establishment had already made, capital would be redirected away from that technology. If an inventor could not find funding, the technology would not develop, regardless of whether it was technically viable. The infrastructure that was being built in the 1880s and 1890s was creating conditions for a particular kind of future in which power, both electrical and metaphorical, would be centralized. Power generation would be concentrated in a few locations. Power distribution would be controlled by a few companies. Access to power would be mediated through centralized institutions. This was not the only possible future. The alternative future enabled by wireless power transmission would have been radically decentralized. Power could be generated locally, transmitted wirelessly, accessed without mediation by centralized distribution companies. In that future, the centralized control of power would have been impossible. The choice between these futures was not made by the market. It was made by the financial interests that controlled capital allocation. The suppression of wireless power technology had implications that extended far beyond the electrical industry. The centralization of power generation and distribution that resulted from the suppression of wireless transmission became the model for how other essential resources would be organized in the 20th century. Oil would be distributed through centralized networks of pipelines and refineries, controlled by a small number of companies. Water would be distributed through centralized systems, controlled by municipalities or regulated utilities. Communications would be distributed through centralized networks controlled by telephone and later internet companies. The pattern of centralized control over essential resources became the organizing principle of the modern economy, and it originated, in part, in the deliberate suppression of a technology that would have enabled decentralized distribution. The story of wireless power transmission is not simply a story about a lost technology. It is a story about how the future is actually determined. The future is not determined by which technologies are most efficient or most beneficial to humanity. It is determined by which technologies serve the interests of the financial and industrial establishment that controls capital allocation. Technologies that threaten the profitability of existing systems are suppressed, regardless of their potential benefits. Technologies that enable centralized control are promoted, regardless of their efficiency or their effects on human welfare. Wireless power transmission was suppressed because it would have decentralized control over electrical power, threatening the business model of centralized distribution. That suppression was not the result of technological limitations or market competition. It was a result of deliberate financial coordination to direct industrial development in a particular direction. The evidence for this suppression exists in fragments scattered across multiple archives. It exists in Tesla's unfinished projects and destroyed research notes. It exists in the shifting patterns of patent applications, as wireless power patents suddenly ceased to be filed after 1910. It exists in the absence of wireless power transmission in textbooks and technical journals, an absence made more conspicuous by the frequency of the technology in earlier publications. It exists in the testimony of engineers and inventors who worked on the technology and who understood that their work was being deliberately blocked. It exists in the financial records showing how capital that might have flowed toward wireless power development was instead directed towards centralized distribution infrastructure. What this history reveals is that the choice to build a centralized electrical grid was not simply a technical choice based on engineering principles. It was a financial and political choice based on the interests of those who controlled capital. The centralized grid made possible a particular kind of economy and a particular kind of power structure. It created situations in which a small number of companies could control access to an essential resource. It created the conditions for monopoly formation and profit extraction. It enabled the coordination of power that characterized the 20th century, and it was achieved in part by suppressing a technology that would have made such centralization impossible. The suppression of wireless power transmission did not occur in isolation. It was part of a much larger pattern of technological direction that characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During the same period, other technologies that would have enabled decentralization were being suppressed or redirected towards centralized control. The automobile industry, which emerged in the 1890s and early 1900s, faced a critical choice between electric vehicles and gasoline vehicles. Electric vehicles were cleaner, quieter, and more suitable for urban use. Gasoline vehicles required an enormous infrastructure of refineries, pipelines, and service stations infrastructure that would create centralized control over personal transportation. The financial interests that controlled the emerging automobile industry chose to promote gasoline vehicles and to marginalize electric vehicles. By the 1920s, electric vehicles had been effectively eliminated from the market, despite the fact that they were technologically viable and superior in many respects. This pattern repeats across multiple industries. In agriculture, the choice was made to promote mechanized, centralized farming dependent on purchased inputs, gasoline, fertilizers, seeds, rather than supporting decentralized, diversified farming that would have been more self-sufficient. In food production, centralized industrial agriculture was promoted over distributed local food systems. In communications, the centralized telephone monopoly controlled by AT&T was protected and promoted over alternative communication technologies that might have enabled more distributed systems. In energy, oil and coal were promoted over distributed renewable energy sources. In each case, the choice was not simply a technical choice. It was a choice made by financial interests to direct development towards systems that enabled centralized control. The mechanism through which these technological choices were imposed was the same mechanism we examined in relation to the Rockefeller family and Standard Oil: coordinated capital allocation by banking and financial interests, combined with political influence to shape regulatory frameworks that favored centralized systems. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the banking establishment was consolidating control over American financial resources. The same financial interests that had coordinated the consolidation of oil refining under Rockefeller control were also coordinating the consolidation of electrical power distribution, railroad development, and industrial production. These were not separate processes. They were pieces of a single strategy to organize the American economy in a way that would enable centralized control over essential resources and production. The regulatory frameworks that were established during this period were designed to reinforce centralized control while appearing to serve the public interest. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established in 1887, was supposed to regulate railroad companies in the public interest. What it actually did was establish frameworks that protected railroad monopolies from competition while appearing to constrain them. State public utility commissions were established to regulate electrical utilities. What they actually did was establish frameworks that protected utility monopolies while appearing to constrain them. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to prevent monopolies. What it actually did was provide the legal language for preventing new competitors from entering industries that had already been consolidated by financial interests. The consolidation of electrical power distribution provides the clearest example of how this system operated. In the 1880s and 1890s, electrical power distribution was not a monopoly. Multiple companies operated electrical systems in different cities. There was competition between Edison's direct current systems and Westinghouse's alternating current systems. There were local utilities and private companies. There was in principle a competitive market in electrical power distribution. What happened over the course of the 1890s and early 1900s was the consolidation of this fragmented landscape into a small number of large utilities, each controlling electrical distribution across an entire region. This consolidation was not the result of superior technical efficiency or superior business practices. It was the result of coordinated capital allocation by banking interests combined with political influence to shape regulatory frameworks that made consolidation inevitable. The larger utilities could access capital from major banks at favorable rates. Smaller utilities could not. The regulatory frameworks being established privileged large utilities with economies of scale, while disadvantaging smaller operators. The larger utilities could lobby more effectively for favorable regulations. Smaller utilities had less political influence. The result was a consolidation process that was presented as inevitable market competition, but which was actually directed consolidation, orchestrated through banking coordination and regulatory design. The financing of electrical utility consolidation reveals the banking coordination clearly. Major banks formed syndicates to finance large utility companies. These syndicates would identify a major city or region, finance the acquisition or expansion of utility companies operating there, and consolidate them into a single large utility. The Morgan Bank was prominent in this process. Other New York banks participated. The result was that by 1920, the majority of American electrical distribution was controlled by a small number of large utilities, each connected to banking interests and each operating under regulatory frameworks that protected their monopoly position. The suppression of wireless power transmission needs to be understood within this context. Wireless power transmission was not suppressed simply because J.P. Morgan decided it threatened his interests, though that was certainly part of it. It was suppressed because it threatened the entire strategy of organizing American industry around centralized control over essential resources. The electrical utilities that had been established with banking capital would have become obsolete if wireless power transmission became viable. The regulatory frameworks that had been established to protect utility monopolies would have become irrelevant. The business model of centralized power generation and distribution would have collapsed. The decision to suppress wireless power transmission was therefore a decision made by the financial and industrial establishment to foreclose a particular kind of future in favor of another kind of future. It was a decision to organize electrical power around centralized generation and distribution rather than around distributed wireless transmission. It was a decision that would have enormous consequences for how the 20th century would unfold. It would mean that power, both electrical and metaphorical, would be centralized. It would mean that access to essential resources would be mediated through monopoly utilities. It would mean that the organization of society would be structured around dependence on centralized institutions. The political and regulatory context in which this decision was made is important to understand. The Peugeot committee hearings that documented the money trust's coordination occurred in 1912 and 1913, after the suppression of wireless power transmission was already well advanced. The antitrust action against Standard Oil occurred in 1911, after Standard Oil had already consolidated the oil industry. The regulatory frameworks that were supposed to prevent monopolies had been established by the time the most important consolidations had already been accomplished. This timing was not accidental. The financial and industrial establishment moved quickly to consolidate industries and centralize control before the public and the political system fully understood what was happening. By the time regulatory and antitrust mechanisms were in place, the consolidation was already complete. The role of public consciousness and narrative control in enabling this consolidation cannot be overstated. The public was largely unaware that technological choices were being made, that alternative futures were being foreclosed, that their relationship to essential resources was being restructured to enable centralized control. The newspaper coverage of wireless power transmission in the 1890s was often sensational and speculative, describing Tesla's work as the work of a genius, but also subtly suggesting that the technology might be impractical or dangerous. The technical journals that covered wireless power systems gradually became harder to access. The public demonstrations that had shown the technology working were replaced by reports of failures or incomplete demonstrations. By the early 1900s, the dominant narrative in the press and in technical literature was that wireless power transmission was not viable, that it was the dream of an eccentric genius but not a practical technology. This narrative was false. The technology was viable, but the narrative served the interests of those who wanted to suppress it. Once the public believed that wireless power transmission was not viable, there was no pressure to develop the technology. Once the technical community believed the technology was not viable, research interest declined. Once investment capital was directed elsewhere, the technology could not develop. The suppression was accomplished not primarily through force or official prohibition, but through narrative control that convinced people the technology was not viable. The same mechanism operated across multiple industries. Electric vehicles were portrayed as inferior to gasoline vehicles despite being superior in many respects. Decentralized agriculture was portrayed as inefficient and backward compared to industrial agriculture. Local food systems were portrayed as primitive and unsanitary compared to centralized industrial food production. In each case, the narrative control was so effective that people came to believe that the centralized system was not simply the dominant system, but the only viable system, the system that progress demanded. The role of educational institutions in maintaining this narrative control is significant. Universities receive funding from the financial interests that benefited from centralized industrial organization. Rockefeller and other banking families funded universities and research institutions. These institutions trained engineers and scientists who would then work on problems defined by the financial interests that funded the institutions. Research that challenged centralized systems was marginalized or underfunded. Research that reinforced centralized systems was promoted. The result was that generations of engineers and scientists were trained to believe that centralized systems were technically superior and that decentralized alternatives were not viable. The suppression of wireless power transmission was therefore not simply a matter of suppressing a particular technology. It was part of a much larger system of directing technological development in ways that served the interests of financial and industrial power. It involved coordinated capital allocation. It involved political influence over regulatory frameworks. It involved narrative control through press, technical journals, and educational institutions. It involved the marginalization and obscuration of alternative technological possibilities. The result was that the future that actually emerged, a future organized around centralized control over electrical power, transportation, food, communications, and other essential resources, appeared to be the inevitable result of technological progress and market competition, when in reality it was the result of deliberate choices made by financial and industrial interests. The contemporary implications of understanding this history are substantial. We live in a world organized around centralized control over essential resources and production. This organization appears natural to us because it is all we have known, but it is the product of choices made a century ago to suppress alternative technological possibilities. The wireless power transmission technology that was suppressed in the 1890s was genuinely viable. If it had been developed instead of suppressed, the 20th century would have unfolded very differently. Electrical power would be distributed wirelessly rather than through wires. The monopoly utilities that control electrical distribution would not exist. The relationship between people and essential resources would be fundamentally different. This historical fact has profound implications for understanding the present. We are often told that the centralized systems we depend on are the result of technological progress and market competition, that they represent the most efficient possible organization of production and resource distribution. But the history of technological suppression and direction suggests otherwise. The centralized systems we have are the product of deliberate choices by financial interests to organize the economy in ways that maximize their control and profit. Alternative systems that might have been more efficient, more sustainable, more democratic, and more beneficial to human welfare were suppressed because they threatened the ability of financial interests to concentrate power. The suppression of wireless power transmission is not simply a historical curiosity. It is an example of how power actually operates in capitalist systems. It reveals how technological futures are determined not by which technologies are most beneficial to humanity, but by which technologies serve the interests of those who control capital. It reveals how the appearance of technological inevitability and market competition obscures the reality of deliberate direction by financial and industrial power. It reveals how narrative control is used to convince people that suppressed alternatives were never viable, were never real possibilities worth considering. Understanding this history is important because it opens the possibility of imagining different futures. If the centralized systems we depend on were not inevitable technological progressions, but rather the products of deliberate choices by financial interests, then alternative systems are possible. If wireless power transmission was suppressed a century ago, the question becomes, what technologies are being suppressed today? What alternative futures are being foreclosed by the choices of financial and industrial interests? What would be possible if we could break the pattern of suppression and direction that has characterized technological development for over a century? The answer to these questions depends on understanding not just the suppression of wireless power, but the system of suppression itself. The mechanisms through which financial interests direct technological development, the ways in which regulatory frameworks are designed to protect centralized systems, the role of narrative control in convincing people that centralized systems are inevitable and that alternatives are not viable. Once that system is understood, the possibility of changing it becomes visible, not as an immediate practical possibility, because the system is deeply entrenched and defended by enormous power. but as a theoretical possibility, as something that could potentially be imagined and constructed differently if enough people understood what the current system actually is and how it actually operates. The wireless power transmission that was suppressed a century ago was not simply a lost technology, it was a closed door in the history of possible futures. Understanding what lay behind that closed door, why it was closed and how it was closed, is the first step toward opening other doors that are currently being closed, toward imagining futures different from the centralized, controlled, dependent futures that financial and industrial power is currently directing us toward. The establishment of electrical utility monopolies in the early 20th century was presented to the public as a triumph of rational organization and technical efficiency. The narrative was straightforward. Multiple competing electrical companies operating in the same territory was wasteful and duplicative. A single large utility could operate more efficiently, could serve more customers at lower cost, could invest in infrastructure expansion and improvement with greater resources. Therefore, consolidation into monopoly utilities was not simply a business trend, it was a technical necessity. This narrative was false, but it was so effectively promoted through newspapers, technical journals, and political discourse that it became the dominant understanding of electrical utility organization. The reality was far different. The consolidation of electrical utilities into monopolies was driven by financial interests seeking to maximize control and profit, not by technical efficiency considerations. The supposed inefficiencies of competition were largely mythical. Multiple electrical companies operating in the same territory could compete on price and service quality. This competition would have kept costs lower for consumers and would have provided incentives for technological innovation. The consolidation into monopolies eliminated this competition and created situations where utilities could charge higher prices, invest less in infrastructure improvement, and operate with minimal pressure to innovate or serve customers effectively. The regulatory frameworks that were established to oversee these newly consolidated monopolies were presented as mechanisms for protecting the public interest. The state public utility commissions that were established in state after state had the power to regulate rates, to require service quality standards, to oversee utility planning and investment. In theory, these regulatory bodies would ensure that utilities charged fair rates and provided adequate service. In practice, they became mechanisms for protecting monopoly utilities from competition and from public pressure. The mechanism through which regulatory capture operated is important to understand. The utility companies appointed the people who would serve on the regulatory commissions. The appointment process was not direct. Commissioners were officially appointed by governors, not by utilities, but the utilities had enormous political influence. Through campaign contributions, through lobbying, through the threat of withdrawing investment from particular regions, utilities could influence which people the governors appointed. The result was that regulatory commissioners were typically either former utility executives, people with financial interest in utilities, or people who understood their future prospects depended on maintaining good relationships with the utilities they regulated. Once the regulatory framework was in place, the utilities could operate behind the shield of public regulation while actually escaping meaningful constraint. The utilities would propose rate increases, claiming that they needed higher rates to invest in infrastructure and maintain service quality. The Regulatory Commission, staffed with utility-friendly people, would approve the increases. The utilities would pocket the additional revenue without actually making the infrastructure investments. The public believed that the Regulatory Commission was protecting their interests. In reality, the regulatory framework was protecting the utilities from competition and from political pressure to lower rates or improve service. The financial benefits of this arrangement were substantial. The consolidated utilities could charge significantly higher rates than would have been possible in a competitive market. The higher rates meant higher profits. The higher profits meant higher returns for investors. The investors included, prominently, the banking interests that had financed the consolidation in the first place. J.P. Morgan's bank, for example, had financed the formation of General Electric, which consolidated electrical equipment manufacturing and which had financial interests in the electrical utilities that purchased its equipment. The same financial interests that owned the utilities also owned the companies that supplied the utilities. The entire system was organized to maximize profit extraction. The suppression of wireless power transmission needs to be understood as an essential component of this profit maximization system. If wireless power transmission had become viable, the entire infrastructure of centralized generation and distribution would have become obsolete. The investments that the banking interests had made in building that infrastructure would have become worthless. The monopoly utilities that had been established would have had no competitive advantage. The profit extraction system would have collapsed. The suppression of wireless power transmission was therefore not simply an act of eliminating a competing technology. It was an act of protecting the enormous financial investments that had been made in centralized electrical infrastructure and the profit streams that the monopoly utilities generated. The costs of this suppression were substantial, though they were largely invisible to the public because they were not easily quantifiable or visible in historical record. The wireless power transmission technology that was suppressed would have enabled electrical power to be distributed without the need for massive infrastructure investments in wires, poles, and distribution networks. The energy losses in transmission and distribution could have been significantly reduced. The decentralization of power generation would have been possible, meaning that smaller, more local power generation facilities could have served local power needs. The dependency on centralized utilities would have been eliminated. What actually happened instead was that the United States built an enormous infrastructure of electrical wires and transmission lines, one of the largest and most capital-intensive infrastructure projects in history. This infrastructure required continuous maintenance and replacement. It required continuous expansion as new areas were connected to the grid and as electricity demand increased. The infrastructure was owned and controlled by monopoly utilities, which extracted significant profit from operating and maintaining it. The infrastructure created permanent dependency. Once areas were connected to the electrical grid, they were dependent on the centralized utility for their power supply. They could not opt out, could not turn to alternatives, could not escape the monopoly pricing and control. The environmental costs of centralizing electrical generation around fossil fuel power plants were also enormous, though again these costs were largely invisible and unquantified at the time. The centralized power plants required massive inputs of coal or oil. The transportation of these fuels required infrastructure and energy. The emissions from burning these fuels accumulated in the atmosphere and contributed to climate change. The mining and drilling required to extract the fuels caused environmental damage. All of these costs were externalized, not paid by the utilities or their customers, but absorbed by society and the environment. If wireless power transmission had been developed, the trajectory of electrical power would have been radically different. Smaller, distributed power generation would have been possible. Local renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydroelectric, could have been developed and used locally without requiring massive transmission infrastructure. The dependency on fossil fuels would have been much reduced. The environmental damage from centralized power generation would have been avoided. The profile of the 20th century energy system would have been fundamentally different. The suppression of wireless power transmission also had implications for how other technologies would develop. Once it became clear that centralized control over electrical power was economically viable and politically protected, the same model was applied to other essential resources. Oil was organized around centralized refineries and distribution networks. Water was organized around centralized treatment and distribution systems. Communications were organized around centralized telephone networks. In each case, the model of centralized control over an essential resource proved extremely profitable. The financial interests that had discovered this model through the consolidation of electrical utilities applied it repeatedly. The pattern became clear by the early 20th century. The most profitable industries were those that could achieve centralized monopoly control over essential resources. The most reliable sources of investment returns were monopoly utilities protected by regulatory frameworks that prevented competition. The financial establishment oriented itself around financing the consolidation of industries into monopolies and the establishment of regulatory frameworks to protect those monopolies. This became the dominant model for industrial organization throughout the 20th century. The suppression of wireless power transmission was therefore not simply a technological decision. It was a strategic decision to organize the American economy around centralized monopoly control. It was a decision made by financial interests seeking to maximize their own power and profit. It was a decision that would have enormous consequences for how the 20th century would unfold, determining how energy would be organized, where people would live, how they would work, what kind of society and environment would be created. The public was largely unaware that any decision had been made. The public understood electrical power consolidation as a technical and economic necessity, not as a deliberate choice by financial interests to foreclose alternative possibilities. The public accepted the regulatory frameworks that protected monopoly utilities as public protections, not recognizing them as mechanisms of regulatory capture. The public believed in progress, in technological inevitability, in the idea that the systems being built were the best possible systems because they were the systems that had actually been chosen. A narrative control that had convinced people that wireless power transmission was not viable extended to convincing them that the centralized systems that had been built were inevitable and optimal. The evidence for the suppression and its mechanisms exists in multiple forms, though it requires careful examination to see clearly. The patent record shows a dramatic decline in wireless power transmission patents after 1905. The technical literature shows a shift in tone around the same time, from speculative excitement about wireless power possibilities to skepticism about their viability. The biographical records of engineers and inventors who worked on wireless power systems show repeated patterns of funding being withdrawn, projects being abandoned, research being redirected. The financial records show capital flowing away from wireless power research towards centralized electrical infrastructure. The most damning evidence is comparative. During the same period that wireless power research was being suppressed in the United States, alternative energy systems were not being suppressed. Fossil fuel research was actively promoted. Coal mining technology was developed and improved. Oil refining technology was advanced. Hydroelectric power generation was expanded. All of these technologies fit within the model of centralized power generation and distribution. They receive substantial capital investment and support from financial interests. The contrast between the vigorous promotion of technologies that fit the centralized model and the suppression of technologies that would have enabled decentralization is stark and revealing. The suppression of wireless power transmission also affected how subsequent technologies would develop. Radio technology emerged in the early 20th century, building on some of the same principles as wireless power transmission. But radio technology was developed and deployed in ways that maintained centralized control. Radio broadcasting operated through centralized transmitters controlled by major corporations, and later by government. The possibility of decentralized radio communication, where many people could transmit as well as receive, was foreclosed. Radio became another technology of centralized control and communication. The same pattern would repeat with television, with telecommunications, with the internet. In each case, the technology could theoretically have been organized around decentralized control, but in each case the organizational model that actually emerged was one of centralized control mediated through monopoly utilities or corporations. This was not accident or technical necessity, it was the result of financial interests learning from the suppression of wireless power transmission how to direct technological development in ways that preserved centralized control. The suppression of wireless power transmission established a template for how financial and industrial power would operate in the 20th century. The template is identify technologies that threaten centralized control, suppress them through multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously: capital withdrawal, narrative control, regulatory design, political influence. Promote instead technologies that enable or reinforce centralized control. Present the resulting system as the inevitable product of technological progress and market competition, while actually directing technological development through coordinated financial strategy. Understanding this template is crucial for understanding how technological futures are actually determined. We live in a world where certain technological possibilities seem inevitable, and others seem impossible or impractical. We believe we have the best possible systems because we have the systems that were chosen, but the history of technological suppression and direction suggests otherwise. The systems we have are the products of deliberate choices by financial and industrial power. Alternative systems were possible but were foreclosed. Understanding which alternatives were foreclosed and why is the first step toward imagining and constructing different technological futures. The wireless power transmission technology that was suppressed a century ago represented a fundamental alternative to the centralized systems that came to dominate the 20th century. It represented the possibility of decentralized electrical power. It represented the possibility that people could generate and access power locally without dependency on centralized utilities. It represented a future organized around independence rather than dependency, around distribution rather than concentration. That future was foreclosed not because wireless power transmission was technically inferior, but because it threatened the ability of financial and industrial power to concentrate control over essential resources. Today, we face similar choices about how to organize other essential systems, how to organize information, how to organize food production, how to organize transportation, how to organize financial systems. In each case, the question is whether the systems will be organized around centralized control or around distribution. The history of wireless power transmission suppression suggests that financial interests will work to establish centralized control because centralized control maximizes profit and power concentration. Understanding how this process operates, understanding it clearly enough to see through the narrative of technological inevitability, is the foundation for making different choices about how to organize the future. The question that emerges from understanding the suppression of wireless power transmission is deceptively simple but profound in its implications. What would the world look like if wireless power had been developed instead of suppressed? The answer is not simply that people would have free electricity, though that would certainly have been true. The answer is that the entire structure of modern civilization would be fundamentally different. The dependency relationships that organize contemporary life would not exist. The concentration of power that characterizes the modern world would be impossible. The relationship between people and essential resources would be inverted from dependent to independent. Consider what wireless power transmission would have meant for the organization of society. Electrical power would have been available anywhere, transmitted wirelessly through the air and the earth. There would have been no need for massive infrastructure networks of wires and poles and transmission lines. There would have been no need for centralized power plants generating enormous quantities of electricity for distribution across regions. Power could have been generated locally at small scales and distributed wirelessly to wherever it was needed. The centralized utility companies that came to dominate the 20th century would have had no reason to exist. What this would have meant for people's lives is difficult to overstate. First, it would have meant genuinely free electricity. Once the initial infrastructure for wireless power transmission was built, the marginal cost of transmitting additional electricity would have been essentially zero. The utilities could not have extracted monopoly profits from electricity distribution because there would have been no scarcity to exploit. Power would have been as abundant as air, available to everyone without mediation by centralized institutions. The dependency relationship that binds modern people to electrical utilities would never have developed. Second, it would have meant decentralization of economic organization. Without centralized electrical infrastructure, manufacturing could have been distributed across the landscape instead of being concentrated in cities and industrial centers. Small-scale manufacturing could have been viable. Local production would have been possible. The massive urban concentration that characterized the 20th century people moving to cities to work in factories dependent on centralized electrical power would not have been necessary. The geography of human settlement would have been fundamentally different. Third, it would have meant a radical increase in individual and community autonomy. Communities could have generated their own power, controlled their own energy sources, been independent of centralized institutions for one of their most essential needs. Individuals and small groups could have operated machinery, powered their homes, run their businesses without dependency on utility companies or government regulators. The power relationships that characterize modern life, where centralized institutions control access to essential resources and people are dependent on those institutions, would have been fundamentally different. But wireless power transmission was suppressed. The future that would have been enabled by wireless power was foreclosed. Instead, the future that was built was one of centralized control over electrical power and by extension over other essential resources. The suppression of wireless power transmission was not simply the suppression of a technology. It was the foreclosure of a particular kind of society, a particular kind of relationship between people and resources, a particular kind of future. The implications of understanding this extend far beyond the history of electrical power. Once we understand that wireless power transmission was suppressed not because it was technically inferior, but because it threatened concentrated financial power, the question becomes, what other technologies are being suppressed for the same reason? What other decentralizing technologies have been foreclosed? What other alternative futures have been eliminated through the same mechanisms of financial control, political influence, and narrative management? The answer, when you examine technological history carefully, is that wireless power transmission was not unique. It was one example of a pattern that has repeated throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Every technology that threatened centralized control has been suppressed or redirected towards centralized application. Every technology that enabled decentralization has been blocked or co-opted into centralized forms. Consider agriculture. The technology existed in the early 20th century to support diverse, decentralized farming that produced a variety of crops, that maintained soil fertility through rotation and organic methods, that did not require expensive inputs from centralized corporations. But the agricultural system that developed was industrialized, centralized, and dependent on inputs from corporations. The small farmer was displaced. Agricultural production was consolidated into large operations dependent on purchased seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. This was not the inevitable result of technological progress. It was the result of financial interests directing agricultural development towards centralized systems that maximize their control and profit. Consider transportation. Electric vehicles existed in the early 20th century. They were superior to gasoline vehicles, in many respects cleaner, quieter, more reliable. But the transportation system that developed was based on gasoline vehicles dependent on centralized oil refineries and distribution networks. This was not because gasoline vehicles were technically superior. It was because the financial interests that controlled oil refining, the Rockefeller interests and others, had the power to direct transportation development towards systems dependent on their products. Consider communications. Radio technology could have been developed to allow many people to transmit as well as receive, creating a decentralized communication system. But radio was developed as a centralized broadcast system, where a small number of stations transmitted to many passive receivers. Television followed the same pattern. The internet initially had decentralizing potential, but has been progressively centralized through the consolidation of control in the hands of a small number of corporations. Consider medicine. Medical knowledge could have been organized around decentralized, community-based healing practices that empowered individuals and communities to manage their own health. But the medical system that developed was centralized around hospitals and pharmaceutical corporations that control medical knowledge and practice. The suppression of alternative medical practices that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries paralleled the suppression of wireless power transmission. Both threatened to decentralize control over an essential resource. Consider finance. The technology exists for direct exchange of value between individuals without mediation by banks or other centralized financial institutions. But the financial system that developed is one of centralized banks, centralized control of currency, centralized mediation of financial transactions. The suppression of alternative currencies and financial systems, the establishment of central banks, the legal frameworks that prevent decentralized finance, all of these represent foreclosure of alternative financial futures. The pattern is consistent across every domain of essential resources and services. The technologies that would have enabled decentralization were suppressed. The technologies that enabled centralized control were promoted. The result is the world we live. In a world where essential resources are controlled by centralized institutions, where people are dependent on those institutions, where autonomous operation is difficult or impossible without accessing resources controlled by others. This was not inevitable. It was not the result of technological progress or market competition. It was the result of deliberate choices by financial and industrial power to suppress decentralizing technologies and promote centralizing ones. Understanding this changes how we interpret the world we live in. The systems that appear natural to us, the systems that appear to be the inevitable results of technological progress, are actually the products of suppressed alternatives and foreclosed possibilities. The wireless power transmission that was suppressed represents more than just lost electricity. It represents a lost future of decentralized, independent, autonomous human organization. It represents a future where people would have had direct control over an essential resource. It represents a future where the concentration of power that characterizes modernity would have been impossible. It represents a future where the dependency relationships that bind modern people to centralized institutions would never have developed. Understanding why wireless power transmission was suppressed requires understanding the system of power that did the suppressing. It was not a government agency that suppressed the technology. Wireless power transmission was suppressed by financial interests, by the banking families and industrial corporations that had invested in centralized electrical infrastructure and that benefited from monopoly control over electrical power distribution. It was suppressed through mechanisms of capital control, political influence, and narrative management. It was suppressed to protect the profits and power of those who controlled centralized systems. The suppression of wireless power transmission was therefore an act of violence, not physical violence, though physical violence was sometimes involved when people tried to resist the imposition of centralized systems, but violence in the deeper sense, the imposition of particular organizational structures on society against what would have been the preference of most people if given genuine choice. The suppression foreclosed possibilities, eliminated alternatives, constrained human freedom and autonomy. It imposed a particular future on society because that future served the interests of concentrated financial power. The contemporary relevance of understanding this history cannot be overstated. We face choices today about how to organize emerging technologies that are in many ways parallel to the choices about electrical power a century ago. Artificial intelligence technology could be organized around centralized control by a small number of corporations, or it could be organized around distributed systems where many people and communities have agency in how AI affects their lives. The choice between these alternatives is not being made by the public through democratic processes. It is being made by financial and technology interests based on which organizational form maximizes their power and profit. Renewable energy technologies could be organized around decentralized generation and distribution, solar panels on homes and communities, local wind generation, distributed battery storage. This would enable genuine energy independence and would eliminate the need for centralized utilities. But the renewable energy systems being promoted and funded by major financial interests are organized around centralized generation, utility-scale solar and wind farms, centralized battery storage, continued dependence on centralized distribution networks. The choice to promote centralized over decentralized renewable energy is made by financial interests that benefit from maintaining centralized control. Food systems are at a critical juncture. The technology exists for people and communities to produce much of their own food locally through permaculture, vertical farming, and other distributed agricultural methods. But the agricultural system being promoted and funded by financial interests is one of continued industrial agriculture, continued dependence on centralized food corporations, continued mediation of food production through centralized institutions. The choices about how food systems will evolve are being made by financial interests, not by democratic processes or by consideration of what would serve human welfare and autonomy. Information systems face similar choices. Decentralized social media platforms could allow communities to control their own communication and information sharing without mediation by centralized corporations. But the dominant platforms are highly centralized, controlled by a small number of corporations designed to maximize their control over information flow and user behavior. The choices about how information systems will develop are being made by the corporations that benefit from centralization, not by consideration of what would serve human autonomy and democratic participation. The pattern that was established with wireless power transmission, the suppression of decentralizing technologies, and the promotion of centralizing ones, continues to operate. The mechanisms have become more sophisticated. The narrative management is more effective. The integration of financial and political power is more complete. But the fundamental logic remains the same. Technologies that threaten concentrated power are suppressed. Technologies that enable centralized control are promoted. The future is being directed according to the interests of those who control capital, not according to what would serve human welfare or autonomy. Understanding the suppression of wireless power transmission is therefore not simply a matter of understanding a historical injustice. It is a matter of understanding how power operates in the present. It is a matter of recognizing that the apparent inevitability of centralized systems masks deliberate choices and suppressed alternatives. It is a matter of understanding that the future is not determined by technological progress, but by who controls the capital that directs technological development. The question that wireless power transmission raises but leaves unanswered in the historical record is, what if the suppression had not succeeded? What if wireless power transmission had been developed and had become the dominant form of electrical power distribution? The answer is that the 20th and 21st centuries would have been fundamentally different. The concentration of power that characterizes modernity would have been impossible. The dependency relationships that bind people to centralized institutions would not have developed. The future would have unfolded according to very different logic. This counterfactual history is not simply an interesting thought experiment. It is a way of understanding what was actually at stake in the suppression. What was suppressed was not simply a technology. What was suppressed was a possibility of human organization fundamentally different from what actually emerged. What was suppressed was autonomy, independence, decentralization, distributed power. What was preserved and promoted was dependence, centralization, concentrated power, control. The wireless electricity that was suppressed in the 1890s and early 1900s represented free energy in the most literal sense, energy that could be accessed without payment to centralized institutions, without dependency on utility companies, without the mediation of regulators and monopolists. It represented the possibility of abundance rather than scarcity. It represented the possibility of independence rather than dependency. These possibilities were foreclosed not because they were technically impossible, but because they threatened the ability of financial interests to concentrate power and extract profit. Contemporary society faces a choice about whether to repeat this pattern or to break it. We can allow financial and technology interests to continue directing technological development towards centralized control, suppressing decentralizing alternatives, foreclosing possibilities of human autonomy and independence. Or we can begin to understand how this process operates and begin to make deliberate choices about which technological futures we actually want to create. We can begin to promote technologies that enable decentralization, that empower individuals and communities, that reduce dependency on centralized institutions. We can begin to challenge the narrative of technological inevitability and recognize that different futures are possible if we have the will to create them. The wireless power transmission that was suppressed a century ago is lost. We cannot recover that future. But understanding why it was suppressed, understanding the mechanisms through which it was suppressed, understanding what was at stake in the suppression, provides the foundation for making different choices about the futures we can still create. The choice between centralization and decentralization, between concentrated power and distributed power, between dependency and autonomy, is not a choice being made for us by the inevitable progress of technology. It is a choice that can still be made by us if we understand clearly enough what the choice actually is and what is at stake in it. The free electricity of wireless power transmission that was foreclosed represents something much larger than a lost technology. It represents a lost world of greater human autonomy and less concentrated power. Understanding what was lost, understanding why it was lost, understanding that it was lost not because it was inferior, but because it threatened concentrated power. This understanding is the foundation for imagining and creating different futures. Not simply futures with different technologies, but futures with different relationships between people and power, between individuals and institutions, between human autonomy and concentrated control. The question that wireless power transmission leaves us with is not simply historical, it is urgent and contemporary. What technologies are we suppressing today? What decentralizing possibilities are being foreclosed in the present? What futures of greater autonomy and less concentrated power are being eliminated through the same mechanisms that eliminated wireless power a century ago? These questions cannot be answered by looking at history alone. They require understanding the present clearly enough to see the patterns operating now, the mechanisms through which power is directing technological development, the choices being made about which futures will be enabled and which will be foreclosed. The suppression of wireless power transmission was not the end of a story, it was the establishment of a pattern that has continued for over a century. Understanding that pattern, seeing it clearly in the present, resisting it deliberately, this is the work that remains. The free electricity that was suppressed represents a world that might have been. Understanding why it was suppressed is the first step toward creating different worlds that could still be.